It's like one of those questions. It just keeps coming back,
Mm.
Why is there suffering? Why do bad things happen to good people? I mean, I've definitely thought about it a lot.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a big one, isn't it?
Huge. And this chapter you guys sent in from Alan Kardec's The Gospel, according to the Spirit, blessed are the afflicted. It seems like it might have some different answers.
Yeah, it definitely offers a unique perspective.
So ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. So Kardec, he's coming at this whole question of suffering from the spiritism point of view, right? Like we're eternal spirits living multiple lives.
Exactly. Reincarnation is a key principle in Spiritism.
So we're already thinking bigger than just this one life here. That's interesting. And he starts by quoting from the Bible too. Matthew, Luke, all that stuff. Like, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. It's like there's this promise of future consolation, but it doesn't really say why we have to go through all the tough stuff now, right?
Right. It's kind of a hang in there message, but doesn't explain the why behind the suffering.
Exactly. So where does Kardec go with this?
Well, this is where that bigger picture comes in. He argues that God's justice, it operates on a much grander scale. We can't see it all just within this one lifetime.
Okay, so it's not like random bad luck or anything.
Not quite. He's saying we're experiencing the consequences of our actions.
Yeah.
But not just actions from this life, but from previous lives as well.
Whoa, okay. Hold on. So like past life karma, is that what we're talking about here?
You could say that. He uses the term expiation.
Yeah.
Basically, it's suffering that comes from past wrongs. But the key is it's not about punishment.
What is it about then?
It's more like correction, learning. Like everything we go through, even the tough stuff, it contributes to our spiritual growth in the long run. It's all part of the journey.
Okay. So, two sources of suffering. Stuff we do in this life and stuff from past lives coming back around. He even gives some pretty down-to-earth examples too, like a failed marriage because of vanity, or ending up with ungrateful kids because of bad parenting.
He's really trying to make it relatable, to show how our actions have ripple effects.
Oh, yeah, totally. We've all been there, right? Done something and thought, man, if only I knew then what I know now.
Exactly. He's highlighting that idea that our choices, they always have consequences, both in this life and beyond. But it brings up a question, doesn't it?
What's that?
If all this suffering can be tied back to things we did in past lives, why don't we remember those past lives?
Right. Wouldn't that make things a whole lot easier to understand? Like, if I knew why I was struggling, maybe I'd handle it differently.
He addresses that directly, and his argument is that having those memories, it could actually be more harmful than helpful.
Really? Why?
Think about it. What if we all walked around remembering every grudge, every rivalry, even just embarrassing moments from all our past lives?
Oh, wow, yeah. That would be chaotic, like holding on to all that baggage.
Exactly. So he believes that God, in his wisdom, kind of veils the past to give us a fresh start in each life, a clean slate.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like hitting the reset button, I guess. But wait, so does that mean we're completely in the dark about our past lives? No clues at all?
Not necessarily. He says we do retain, like the essence of those experiences in our character, our conscience.
Interesting. But how?
He gives the analogy of a skill you've mastered. Like you know how to ride a bike. You don't need to remember every time you fell off, still be able to do it, right?
Right. It's just like in there.
Exactly. So the lessons, the experiences from past lives, they're in there too, shaping who we are, even if we don't consciously remember the details.
Okay, so it's like these past lives are kind of working behind the scenes, influencing us. But if suffering is just part of the deal, across all these lifetimes, how are we supposed to deal with it? No one likes to suffer.
That's where his idea of resignation comes in. And it's not about just passively accepting hardship. It's more about shifting your perspective.
Okay, but how do you do that? When you're in the middle of something really tough, it's hard to see the bigger picture.
He argues that seeing this earthly life as just a small part of this much larger journey, it can change how we experience suffering. It's like paying off a debt. It might suck now, but eventually it leads to freedom.
So it's about remembering that this one lifetime, it's not the whole story.
Exactly. And he even shares a story about a man who's in the worst possible situation, literally sitting on a dung heap. And he's still thanking God for the trial.
Wow. That's pretty powerful. It makes you think about how we frame our experiences. Are we focusing on the dung heap, or are we looking for the lesson, the opportunity that might be hidden within it?
That's a great way to put it. That story really highlights the transformative power of faith and a shift in perspective And from there, he goes on to talk about some other heavy topics too, like suicide, mental illness.
Ooh, yeah. Those are big ones. And he's coming at them from the spiritism point of view, right?
He is. He suggests that a lot of mental illness stems from basically not being able to cope with suffering.
That makes me think about how much energy we put into avoiding suffering these days. But what if it's just part of the human experience, something we need to learn to handle, not just escape from?
He seems to be saying that running from suffering might actually make us more vulnerable to it in the long run. And he argues that Spiritism, by offering meaning and hope beyond this life, can help us build the strength, the resilience to face these challenges head on. He even says materialistic views, where it's all about this life, can actually lead to despair.
Whoa, that's a pretty bold statement. But he's not saying we should just like passively accept suffering, right? Like if someone's struggling, are we just supposed to say, well, it's all part of God's plan?
Not at all. He's a huge advocate for compassion, for helping others. He just urges us to realize that we don't always have the full picture. What we see as someone's misfortune might actually be a crucial part of their soul's journey. We'll dive deeper into this idea of helping others through their trials in part 2 of our deep dive. But for now, what are your initial thoughts?
Man, my brain is already spinning. Like this whole idea that suffering is a process of growth even across lifetimes, that's pretty mind-blowing. And this concept of choosing our trials before we're even born, whoa, I have so many questions.
It definitely raises some fascinating questions, and we'll continue to unpack them all in part 2 of our deep dive into Blessed Are the Afflicted. Stay tuned.
All right, so we're back. Last time, things got pretty intense, right? Talking about suffering across lifetimes, past life karma, and even choosing our trials before we're born. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But Kardec, he doesn't just leave us hanging with these, abstract ideas,
Oh, good. Because honestly, sometimes when I'm in the middle of something rough, all that big picture stuff feels kind of far away. I'm just like, help me deal with this now.
Yeah, I get that. It's one thing to understand it all up here, but then life hits you. So thankfully, he also gets into some really practical stuff, how to actually deal with suffering when you're going through it.
Okay, that's what I'm talking about. Because, our listeners are probably thinking the same thing, right? Like, okay, this is all interesting, but what do I do with it?
Exactly. He gets that. So, for example, remember that whole resignation thing? It's not just about accepting whatever happens. It's about shifting your perspective.
Right, right. And he was saying seeing this life as just a blip in eternity, that can help.
Right. That's huge.
Yeah.
It can totally change how we experience the tough stuff.
It's like when you zoom out on a map, that mountain that looked impassable, suddenly it's just a little bump.
Perfect analogy. But of course, it's easier said than done, right? For when you're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
How do you actually do that?
Yeah, good point. Any tips from Kardec?
He suggests a few things. Like first, just reminding yourself that this suffering, it's temporary, it won't last forever, even if it feels like it will.
Okay, so holding on to hope. What else?
He says focus on the lessons. Even in the hardest times, there's something to learn about yourself, about life.
So it's like actively looking for the meaning, even when it hurts.
Exactly. And third, he says try to trust that there's a bigger plan, even if you can't see it right now.
Right. Okay, so it's a mix of faith and being willing to look for the good even when things are bad.
Yeah. In this chapter, it really makes you think we're not just victims of circumstance. We have a say in how we respond.
Yeah.
And that brings us to this really key idea. He talks about finding meaning in suffering.
Instead of just, going through the motions, feeling bad.
Right. It's about asking yourself, okay, what am I learning from this? How can I grow from this? How can I use this to become a better, stronger person?
So not denying the pain, but turning it into something positive. It's like taking that potential stumbling block and turning it into a stepping stone.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about pretending it's easy, but finding that opportunity within it. Remember that story about the guy on the dung heap?
Yeah, he wasn't exactly having a good time.
Right. But he was choosing to find meaning in it, to be grateful, even in that awful situation. It's a whole different way of thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really powerful. It shows that we have a choice, even in the worst situations. We can let it crush us, or we can use it to grow, to become better people.
And it's not all about personal growth either. He also talks about helping others through their struggles.
Oh, right. And he was saying, don't assume we know the whole plan, right? Like if someone's hurting, don't just think, oh, they must deserve this.
Exactly. We can't know the whole story. He urges us to always try to alleviate suffering wherever we see it, to offer comfort, help, whatever we can.
So it's more about compassion than judgment.
Exactly. recognizing that we're all connected and we can be part of each other's healing.
Mm.
And speaking of tough stuff, he doesn't shy away from some really sensitive topics.
Yeah.
Like what happens when someone is terminally ill and suffering terribly? Is it ever okay to, help them die sooner?
Yeah. That's a really heavy one. A lot of people struggle with that. What's his take?
He's very clear that we don't have the right to play God, even if we think we're being merciful. We just can't know if their time has truly come or what's happening spiritually.
It's about respecting life, even when it's hard. It's not about prolonging suffering, but understanding that we don't have the final say.
Right. And then he goes on to talk about suicide.
Oof, yeah. That's something we don't talk about enough. And there's so much stigma around it. What does he say?
He offers this really interesting perspective. He suggests that most suicides, they come from despair, a sense of utter hopelessness, and that this is often made worse by those materialistic views where death is seen as the end.
So he's tying it back to, like, a lack of spiritual understanding, believing that this one life is all there is. But what about people who do believe in an afterlife and still choose to end their lives?
He says, we can never truly understand another person's pain, the burdens they carry. And he emphasizes that even in those darkest moments, there's still hope. Even a tiny bit of hope can make a difference.
So it's not about judging them. It's about recognizing how complex the human experience is and offering compassion even when we don't understand.
Yes, and he actually shares some pretty chilling stories from people who regretted their suicides. They found themselves in a situation far worse than what they'd left behind.
Wow. That's a powerful reminder that there are consequences, but it's not about scaring people, is it?
No, it's more like a cautionary tale and also a reminder that hope exists even in the deepest despair. And that brings us back to the importance of reaching out, offering support, and remembering that we're all in this together. What stands out to you most from this section?
Honestly, I'm struck by how he tackles these really tough subjects head on, but he always offers a way forward. He's not just describing suffering, he's giving us tools to understand it, to deal with it in a healthy way.
That's a great observation. He's not afraid of the hard questions. And he doesn't present suffering as something to just fear or avoid. He sees it as like an essential part of being human, something that can refine us, even bring us closer to God.
That's a really powerful way to look at it, and I think it's a perfect segue into our final part. We'll explore how to find that meaning in the midst of our struggles, and how to use those tough times to propel us forward. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to our deep dive, into Blessed Are the Afflicted. So we've been talking about a lot of pretty intense stuff, like the whole idea of suffering across lifetimes, past life karma, all that. But sometimes I got to be honest, like when you're in the middle of something really tough, all that cosmic stuff, it feels kind of, I don't know, far away.
Yeah, I get that. It can be hard to connect with the big picture when you're struggling in the moment. For sure. Like, what I really need in those times is something practical, some tools to actually help me deal with what's right in front of me.
I hear you. It's one thing to understand the concepts, but it's another thing entirely to apply them when you're feeling the weight of suffering, in your everyday life. So thankfully, Kardec doesn't just leave us hanging with those philosophical theories.
Oh, good. That's what I was hoping.
He actually offers some pretty concrete advice on how to handle those challenges, how to navigate suffering when it shows up in your life.
Okay, good. Because I bet that's what our listeners are wondering too. Like, okay, this is all fascinating, but what do I do with this information?
Exactly. So remember that idea of resignation we talked about earlier? It's not just about accepting whatever life throws at you.
Right. It was more about shifting your perspective.
Right. It's about actively choosing how you're going to look at your situation, how you're going to frame it. And Kardec really emphasizes that when we can see this earthly life as just a small part of a much larger eternal journey, well, it can dramatically change how we experience suffering.
It's like zooming out on a map, right? What looks like a huge obstacle close-up might just be a tiny blip when you see the whole picture.
That's a great way to think about it. But of course, that's easier said than done, right? In the middle of a crisis, it's hard to remember to zoom out.
Yeah, for sure. So any tips from Kardec on how to actually make that mental shift?
He suggests a few things. First, remember that it's temporary. Suffering isn't forever, even if it feels like it in the moment.
Okay, so holding on to hope. Got it. What else?
Focus on what you're learning. Even in the toughest experiences, there are lessons, even painful ones. They can teach us so much about ourselves, about life, about what really matters.
So it's like actively looking for the lesson, the opportunity, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And the third thing he says is to try to trust that there's a bigger plan, even if we can't see it yet.
Right. Having that faith that things are unfolding as they should, even if it doesn't make sense at the time. Okay, so it's a combination of things. Faith, a willingness to look for the meaning, even when things are painful. It sounds like what Kardec is really saying here is that we're not just victims of our circumstances. We actually have a choice in how we respond to what life throws at us.
That's exactly it. We're active participants in our own journey, even when things are tough. And, that brings us to this really powerful idea that he emphasizes a lot, finding meaning in suffering.
It's like instead of just feeling bad for ourselves, we can ask, okay, what am I learning from this? How can I grow from this? What can I take away from this that will make me a better person?
Yeah. It's about not just enduring suffering, but transforming it, turning it into something positive.
It's like taking that stumbling block and turning it into a stepping stone, using it to propel yourself forward.
Exactly. And he uses that analogy, remember, of the blacksmith forging a sword.
Yeah, he talked about the heat and the hammering, that intense process.
Right. That's what makes the blade stronger.
So it's not about seeking out suffering, but about making the most of what we're given, using those difficult experiences to refine ourselves to become more resilient. And this isn't just about personal growth either, right? Because Kardec also talks a lot about how we can help others who are going through difficult times.
He does. And this goes back to that idea of not assuming we know the whole plan. He cautions against letting someone suffer just because we think they've done something wrong to deserve it. We can't know the whole story.
Right. Like maybe they chose this trial for a reason. We just don't know.
Exactly. Instead of judging, he says we should always try to alleviate suffering wherever we see it, to be a source of comfort and support.
So it's about compassion, not judgment. It's about recognizing that we're all connected and we can be part of each other's healing journey.
That's it. And it brings us back full circle to that question we started with. Why is there suffering? Kardec's answer, it's complex, but it boils down to this idea of growth. Suffering is a catalyst, a way for us to evolve spiritually, to purify ourselves. It's not about punishment. It's about becoming better versions of ourselves. And that's a process that can span lifetimes.
Wow. It's been a really thought-provoking deep dive. We've learned so much from Blessed Are the Afflicted. We've challenged our assumptions about suffering, gained a new perspective on life and death, and even picked up some practical tools to deal with our own challenges.
I agree. It's been a great exploration. And for our listeners out there, I hope this deep dive has inspired you to look at your own challenges in a new light. You're not alone on this journey. We're all in this together, and we can support each other as we learn and grow and strive to become the best versions of ourselves.
Beautifully said. And on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.